Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm really excited to be hosting this webinar today, Portraits in Progress, District Share Strategies for Future Ready Skill Assessment. My name is Kyle Dunbar. I'm a researcher at Digital Promise, and we're really excited to share the results from our report about assessment around future ready skills, and we're especially excited to have practitioners here with you to share their stories. Next slide, please. I'm really happy to introduce Dr. Adam Hicks and Dan Pfaff from Shelby County Schools in Kentucky, and Amanda Waldo and Chad Buboltz from Howard-Suamico Schools in Wisconsin. In our session today, we're going to start off with a brief overview of the white paper around assessment approaches and share a little bit from our findings and insights. Then Howard-Suamico School in Shelby County will share more about how they've been approaching assessment around future-ready skills. We'll have a brief amount of time at the end for questions and answers, but please feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A throughout the webinar, and we'll try to answer what we can as we go. So first, a little bit about the report. When we thought about what we really wanted to dig into around Portrait of a Graduate and future-ready skills, we defined future-ready skills around skills such as critical thinking, communication, collaboration, and creative thinking, because these are increasingly being recognized as essential for student success in school and post-secondary pursuits and in life. These competencies not only prepare students to navigate complex challenges, but also empower them to become lifelong learners and pursue meaningful goals. Many districts are defining these future-ready skills and competencies in their portraits of a graduate. And so we really wanted to see how these two things were working together. Because we know that assessment can be a lever for change. When thoughtfully designed, assessment systems can reinforce instructional coherence, provide actionable insights for educators and learners, and support the continuous development of students' future-ready skills. They also can serve as a bridge between vision and practice, helping schools, districts, and states really bring these portraits of a graduate to life. In this report, we interviewed 16 different school districts from across the country, and then 8 attended an in-person convening where we really dug into their problems of practice around assessments for future-ready skills, and also talked about the exciting opportunities that these assessments were offering. In the report, we answer the question, what approaches are school districts leveraging to measure and recognize student growth and development of Portrait of the Graduate skills? I'd now like to introduce my colleague, Katie Wilsack from Pearson, who will share a little bit about the findings and insights in this report.
Hi, everyone. Excited to see you all. So as Kyle mentioned, our question, or our central research question in this report, was really about learning what districts are doing, what's working, what strategies are happening on the ground that are really helping educators gather more information about students' skills and abilities in relation to these future-ready skills and competencies. So our key finding, which may not be surprising to many of y'all, is that districts are really using a variety of methods. And so before we kind of share a little bit about what those are, we wanted to provide a really high-level framework about what we mean when we're talking about assessment. So we're defining assessment as the process of gathering, analyzing, and interpreting student evidence of learning in relation to meaningful learning goals. And so we found different strategies kind of grouped between that collecting evidence, right? So what are you using in the classroom, in your school, to prompt students to produce evidence and demonstrate this skill? So that's how we kind of bucketed some strategies within collecting evidence. Then we thought about how are districts, schools, educators thinking about analyzing and interpreting, right? So you have the evidence. How are you then defining different kind of levels of performance, providing feedback that's normed, really setting expectations for student performance? That's what we've defined as analyzing and interpreting. And then we also heard a lot of strategies around communicating performance and progress. So how are we sharing both with students as well as with communities, stakeholders, how students are developing, and how our programs are impacting student outcomes? So you'll see within each of these buckets some of the key examples and strategies that the 16 districts we talked to shared with us. This is not an exhaustive list of how this could be approached, and certainly many district strategies go across all of these different buckets, right? I think when we think about a core system of assessment, you would have aspects of each of these. You would have the prompt, the task, the assessment that's collecting evidence of student performance. You would then have those strong ways of analyzing that evidence, and then you would have the tool for communication. So some of the key things we saw, and you'll hear much more from our districts who are going to share out, but we heard that there were some folks using more curriculum embedded tasks, performance tasks, and we also heard kind of the different end of the spectrum all the way to more like cumulative defenses of learning. So wide variety. I encourage you to take a look at our report where you can see many, many more examples of these in action. So a couple of those insights tied to those findings, right? We also found that districts had many different goals. And if you can go one slide back, please. Thank you. So there were many different goals of assessment, right? We see that folks want to first measure student ability. So, right, better understand what are Katie's communication skills and abilities? How is she developing? Where can we maybe put her within a rubric so she understands the next step in that progression and teachers can help provide her that feedback? So that was one goal. We also found a lot of districts were looking to improve instruction. So better understand student ability so that they could provide guidance to teachers around how they might be able to shift instruction to support student development in stronger ways. We also found districts wanted to communicate with families, right? Especially if you have a portrait of a graduate, families want to know, how are students doing? How are they progressing? Maybe how can I support them at home? Where are their strengths? Where can we focus more attention? And then also evaluate portrait implementation. So as you'll see, this was a wide variety of goals. And then we also found, which is very promising, right, is that assessments are interconnected with curriculum instruction. This is probably not surprising to you, but when you have a strong vision for where your district is going, what the culture of teaching and learning is, the curriculum instruction and assessment are inextricably linked. Next slide. And I won't spend too much time on this because we want to get to our district shareouts, but a couple other key insights, right? We found a lot of focus with these future ready skills was on growth and the student-centered practices that support that, right? So how are students reflecting, self-evaluating? How are educators and peers providing feedback? And we found that there was a lot more emphasis on that rather than maybe reaching a static kind of level of proficiency or mastery, right? There was much more, these are complex lifelong skills. How are you developing and how can assessments support that? We also found there were some common challenges around reliability and validity and ensuring kind of the technical quality of some assessments, particularly when they're very locally developed, right? And there's kind of sometimes that tension between ensuring that local educator created content and that it's very relevant to your particular students with maintaining some comparability and equivalency across classrooms. And then we also found that there can be some challenges between district assessment practices and state and national accountability systems. So those are just some common things that we found from our districts, but wanted to really spend most of this time hearing directly from two of those districts. So I'm going to pass it over to our colleagues Amanda and Chad from Howard-Suamico School District to share more about their program.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining. My name is Chad Buboltz, and I'm the Assistant Superintendent of the Howard-Suamico School District. We're a school district of about 6,000 students located outside of Green Bay, Wisconsin. And our district began its portrait work in 2017 in all the right ways, engaging our community and staff and students to develop what you see here on the screen with 7 priority skills connected to our graduate profile. Importantly, our district continues to evolve our strategic framework with the community at the center of each part of our strategic process. And with every iteration of that framework, the grad profile skills continue to be a big part of our community conversation. And so that really compels us to assess our progress more deeply and our growth as a commitment to our community. And so Amanda is going to take a little bit of time to discuss the ways in which we've deepened our assessment practices and feedback loops for students.
Thank you, Chad. Hi, Amanda Waldo, Director of Teaching and Learning. So yeah, being able to really focus on authentic assessment at Howard-Suamico School District really has provided us a few really important purposes, and really talking about, collecting important information on how we're doing, and analyzing data, but also most importantly for us is really about giving students multiple opportunities to really practice and showcase the skills of our graduate profile, but to also provide them feedback along the way. So as we think about the various assessments that we design within our district and we implement within our district, it's really not just one assessment defining where a student is at with mastery along a characteristic, but it's a collection of several assessments and learning activities that students can kind of draw conclusions around growth over time. And I think that's just really important to see just as context as we kind of give you some examples of things that we look for within our assessment design. So there's a few things that we have done. If you could just go back one more. There's a few things that we have really valued within our design of assessments. And here are just three higher arching pieces: alignment, authenticity, and engaged learners in the assessment process. But even within this, there's several different look for. So we're going to talk a little bit about just three examples of these look fors, just to give you a sense of what assessment looks like in Howard-Suamico School District. So the first piece that's extremely important to us is that our assessments are aligned to the graduate profile. And so this is a continuum tool that was actually built for the teachers when they were in the design mode of various assessments. So you can see from a phase of work in progress to ready for use to exemplary, a lot. Back at when we were first doing this work, our exemplary really defined what we would use to really monitor student progress over time and look at evidence of growth. So when you're looking at aligned goals, it's really about being directly connected to what we call our graduate profile continuum. So on the next slide, you'll see that this is just an example of, sorry, could you go, oh yeah, right here. So I think one example is we have a lot of really great resources. We know teachers have access to the open, to several resources that have tasks right within them. So I just want to use the example of Open Syed for what our science teachers use as a core resource. So when we're thinking about tasks, this is what they have access to. But as we look at this, this unit is anchored by a compelling phenomenon: the decline of orangutans populations in Indonesia tied to the global demand for palm oil. So students are beginning to wonder how buying everyday products like chocolate might affect species like orangutans in rainforests. They then build and revisit models of ecosystems and examine how resources availability affects populations, and ultimately design land use systems that aim to balance human needs and ecosystem health. So the driving question for our students within this resource is, how does changing ecosystems affect the lives there? And the assessment, the kids are actually designing an ecosystem that would be positive for both human needs and the orangutans. However, when you look at it, it's really a work in progress for us. Maybe ready for use, but if you look at the next slide, it's all about aligning it to our graduate profile outcomes. So we've developed a tool, which a lot of districts have, that is a continuum that kind of describes what the skills and key vocabulary are for different skills within our graduate profile. This is just a brief overview of our solutionist, and the next one is critical thinker. And then when you look at the next tool, teachers are designing outcomes through rubrics to be able to be clear to students what the success outcomes are of the task. And you can see here, naturally, the teachers and the PLCs are aligning from our graduate profile continuum to the tasks that they are designing within their classrooms. Another piece of our continuum for design of assessment is role. So as you see in that task, there really wasn't a defined role for the students, though it was a very strong task. The students were being positive role models and thinking through design. But I think there's other things that we can think about as we're aligning to the vision. On the next slide, you can kind of see with a teacher working with students right within this task that instead of it just being a student role, you transform that role into an authentic career-based experience, and really having kids authentically see how those skills of solutionist and critical thinker are living through the real life careers out in the real world. Another component that we value within the district is students' reflection and having them be engaged in the assessment process. So they're playing an active role in self-assessment and reflection around the graduate profile. In the next slide, you can see an example of bringing that rubric back where the teachers are using this for students to self-assess themselves. So though they're learning and thinking about their design models, they're also connecting it to the critical skills of our graduate profile. Also, though, part of our continuum is that we need students in the process all the time, not just for that final assessment. So this is just an example of a formative check exit ticket where kids are in classroom discussions in the learning, reflecting as well. So we want our kids to be thinking and reflecting amongst the things that they're practicing and demonstrating within the task. So I think a big thing about this again is that, we use these assessments to really help guide students through reflection and giving them explicit feedback. So that rubric is another opportunity to provide kids feedback feedback around those grad profile skills. But we also used it to monitor student outcomes. And Chad's going to talk a little bit about that piece and where actually it was probably one of the more challenging pieces that we ran into our district. We know that creating rubrics and analyzing and scoring is one of the most difficult pieces of the puzzle of assessment. So Chad, you want to tell us a little bit about our journey of looking at student outcome data?
Yeah, so thanks, Amanda. Amanda was able to articulate what that kind of looks like at the classroom level and how deepening assessment can really have an impact on the connection between what our students are learning and our graduate profile skills. But our continuous improvement processes really led us to determine that we have some work to do around assessment. So what you see on the screen on the left is really our first attempt back just after initial implementation at measuring student performance on future-ready skills. So these were largely homegrown teacher assessments, as was alluded to earlier in the presentation. But we found that these instructor-moderated assessments and design components were really not giving us enough system-level data that would give us any indication of how our intended outcomes were reaching all students in the district. So certainly we could see in these relatively disconnected assessments, we could see that some students in some classrooms were getting the assessment and feedback processes that we desired, but being able to provide an update on the health of our future ready system was really important to our district. And you can flip to the next slide. So we then began to build assessments into our district-wide processes. And you can see here one example of a building scorecard, which prioritizes the way in which they provide feedback to students. So placing these assessments at the center of our district level work, providing coherence from one classroom to the next, one building to the next, allowed us to tie our teachers together in a way that sought really to address the needs of all students. And we're seeing important outcomes system-wide, and frankly, a little bit of a flashlight into the deeper work that we have to do to address future-ready skills for all students. So Amanda's going to talk just a little bit about some of the future goals that we have around deepening assessment and moving this system-wide approach forward.
Yeah. So I think the most important thing is that ultimately, by the time students leave our classrooms in high school, is that they get the opportunity to actually experience the ultimate authentic assessment, which is being out into some of the careers that they're interested in, whether that's through just youth apprenticeship opportunities, which this is autumn in that opportunity, but or even just work-based experience, observation labs, whatever it may be. We want to be able to provide students that authentic opportunity to share growth over time to authentic audiences. So being able to take everything they've learned from multiple assessments within the district and be able to have that capstone experience. And I think the next district, Shelby, is going to tell us a little bit more about their journey and where they're at thinking in that way.
Yeah, I'm excited to have Adam and Dan talk to us a little bit more about what they've been doing in Shelby County.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Adam Hicks. I'm the Assistant Superintendent of Curriculum with Shelby County Public Schools in Kentucky. And joining me is Dan Paff. I'll let you introduce yourself, bud.
Yeah. Dan Paff, I'm the Director of Curriculum Instruction and Assessment for Shelby County Public Schools as well.
So much like our colleagues, Amanda and Chad, we started our Profile of a Graduate work several years ago. So we're nearing year 10, where our profile was created with input from around 80 different stakeholders, ranging from locally elected officials to parents, students, teachers, community leaders, etc. In our profile, we determined and identified 6 competencies that our community said that they wanted to see as indicators for success of a Shelby County Public Schools graduate. From there, our district spent several years looking at the specific indicators within our profile and talked a lot to our schools and our community members about what the best way to show our community that our students were meeting the expectations of our profile. So how are we preparing our students ultimately through some type of formal assessment to say that we are delivering on the promises that you've helped us to identify? And so on the next slide, it shows the process that we have worked on really in earnest over the last 5 years. So Shelby County Public Schools has taken a really strategic approach to assess our Profile of a Graduate competencies through our Defense of Learning system. So with our Defenses of Learning, every 5th, 8th, and 12th grade student in SCPS takes part in a defense where they present in front of a group of panelists ranging from community members, students, parents, staff members, on various elements or aspects of the Profile of a Graduate. And so a common question we get asked is, when you say every 5th, 8th, and 12th grader, do you mean every child? And the answer is yes. We're a really unique county in our state in that we have the largest population of Hispanic students per capita in Kentucky by a very substantial margin. And so every year we have numerous defenses of learning that are given in a child's native language. We also make sure that we provide accommodations for students who have exceptional needs. Every single year in Shelby County Public Schools, we have students who are nonverbal and use assistive technology to complete their defenses of learning. One of the more powerful defenses that I was a part of last year was a young 5th grade woman who had a lot of exceptional needs, ranging from an occupational therapist, a speech therapist. She had a special ed case manager. And so her team worked with this young woman to build up her confidence and actually record her defense of learning. Her case manager said actually 12 times until she felt like it was the best representation of how she's embodied these competencies of the profile. And then on the day of her exhibition, the young woman actually invited in her 1st grade teacher, her parents, her OT, her PT. And through that experience, it was amazing. She stood up and said, and this is my defense of learning. Went through her video, not a dry eye in the house. But the powerful part in that is that this assessment tool locally really has allowed us to make sure that we are practicing what we're preaching and that we are creating a localized assessment that truly is giving our community what they need and is allowing us to assess and give feedback on our competencies, regardless of the race, disability, situation, circumstance in life that any of our students have. Some other ways that we build up to that is most of our schools will also do exhibitions of learning. And these are kind of like mini defenses where a teacher or a grade might pick one of the specific competencies of our profile of a graduate and do some project-based learning activity around maybe being an inspired innovator or a critical thinker in order to create a piece of evidence that that student might use in their 5th, 8th, and 12th grade year. Dan and I and our team have built a lot around local accountability. So Kentucky, we're in a period where our legislators are potentially overhauling our state accountability system to include some type of local measures, and in which case our defensive learning system could then theoretically be tied to our assessment, our local assessment, along with those federally required indicators. Two other pieces that have really helped us with this work. We're very fortunate to have a wonderful school board who is very supportive of the vision that our district and our community has towards our profile. We actually have a graduation policy that is board adopted that states that every senior must successfully complete a defensive learning in order to receive a diploma with Shelby County Public Schools. And we actually amended that policy last year to now require every 5th and 8th grade student to successfully defend their learning as a transitional requirement. The last piece of support that we get from our board is we actually have 2 days that are enshrined in our district calendar that are called Defensive Learning Days. This allows us to set a full year in advance for a day in March and a day in April that every 5th, 8th, and 12th grade student will defend their learning in Shelby County Public Schools. We run transportation on those days as normally scheduled to make sure that students who don't have transportation can come to and from school. We provide breakfast and lunch to make sure that all needs are met throughout those days. And it also gives Dan and our college and career readiness team a full year to recruit partners from the community in order to take part in those defenses.
Yeah, those days are oftentimes not a dry eye in the house because of all the kids are able to achieve in a really short, not a short window of time, really over their career when you think about the senior year. But to see a 5th grader stand up in front of everybody and give a presentation that many adults would be like, wow, I wish I could do that, is certainly powerful. But it's also a situation where these don't end up being very cookie cutter. We have some structure in place, but we also give a lot of latitude to the schools, to the kids. I sat in on one of the defenses a year and a half ago where the young man was on the NASCAR circuit, actually, and he brought his vehicle in, brought all of the data from on being on a track and showed us all of those things, which is going to look very different from the assistive technology example that Adam gave you a second ago. But the kids really have an opportunity to operate in their passion area that way. And as Adam said, we really try to make sure that we get community partners involved as well, because especially with these seniors, we have had situations where a community partner has come in and really been impressed with what these young men and women are able to do, and they're like, "Hey, this is somebody we have to have in our organization," which is obviously a big benefit to the kids as well. And Adam started this by talking about how the profile of a graduate was built with a lot of community support. Our local accountability structure is really built on the same foundation, where we have gone out and really asked the community, what is it that you're looking for from the district? Just like the profile of a graduate is looking at what are you looking for in terms of the graduates when they leave. We're fortunate that our state is considering adding this local accountability piece, this profile of a graduate piece for us as part of our accountability system, because there really is, if you think about what it takes to make or for a kid to be successful. Certainly there's a content knowledge piece, but what goes on with Profile of a Graduate is all about these durable skills that are so important. And you need that mix. In an AI world, if you're just content driven, AI can take care of that piece. But on the other side, you can't just be profile driven as well. You need that combination, and these provide a tremendous opportunity to be able to assess those other skills.
And on the next slide, you'll see the particulars of the assessment that Dan expanded on. And this is where you'll actually see a lot of connections to the work that Amanda and Chad discussed with their various rubrics and processes for assessing students around their profile. We have a series of tights and looses that we set for our defenses of learning that we fleshed out into more or less a full-fledged assessment system. Every year, we set a core set of district tights and looses with expectations for each level, ranging from the number of competencies that each student should be able to successfully defend to the time frame that it should take each grade level to successfully defend their learning. One of the largest adjustments that we've made in the past 3 years relies around the way that we have been able to calibrate our staff members around our scoring practices. So every single year we meet with, and actually Dan and I just met with them 2 days ago. We met with about 50 teachers and administrators where we actually go through and record exemplar defenses at all of our schools on a 2-year basis. We then use those defenses of learning coupled with the scoring rubric that is directly reflecting the assessment practices we want to see students exhibit on their profile defenses. And then we calibrate our efforts to make sure that there is some consistency with how we are giving students feedback on those defenses, but also how we're ultimately scoring those student defenses. And we simply score our defenses using a 3-point scale of either meeting, does not meet, or exceeding expectations overall. As Dan mentioned, the community is a huge part of our defenses. And on the next slide, we'll get in a little bit more into some of the successes that we've had. And our community partners on the next slide, you'll see, are an integral part of this. Last year, we had over 100 community members who were not parents or staff members take part in our defenses of learning, ranging from the president of our local hospital to CEOs of our local banks. And Dan mentioned earlier that several of our students actually seniors left their defenses with job offers from those organizations as a direct moment of them taking part in defenses. Our families have come to expect and look forward to our defenses of learning as truly a milestone event for their students. We've been doing these long enough now that every senior this year will have completed an 8th grade defense, and every 8th grader will have now completed a 5th grade defense. So now we've built a system of continuity that will hopefully go well beyond the time that students spend in Shelby County Public Schools to prepare them for the next stages in their academic career. The other thing that's gone well is that calibration process that we've talked about. Our practices locally get tighter and tighter every year. We set up feedback protocols where our teachers tell us what's working, what isn't, and they are our co-creators in this assessment process that allow us to truly determine how our students are ultimately meeting the needs of the profile of a graduate.
And the scoring and calibration piece is important because we do want to make sure that there's a bar and that bar has to be attained. And we do have some situations where kids have to go back and redo these. There's enough time with the graduation requirement side that can get accomplished. But having a bar, having standards is super important. And we make sure that happens as well.
The last two slides that you'll see just really wrap up the challenges that we face with any local assessment and accountability system that's around a profile of a graduate. We're constantly looking to improve. So as with any traditional assessment, there is a lot of variance with the way that some schools are scoring defenses as compared to others. And so that's a piece that we've we've tried to be really conscientious to address with our school leaders as well as our teachers, and that it goes to what Dan just discussed with those calibration efforts. The last piece that I'll hit on is really making sure that this is a system that, as new staff members come into the fold, they can be continuously onboarded on. Being a new teacher is always a big lift in a traditional assessment environment, but when you throw in a robust performance-based assessment, it's a system that requires a little bit more training. So we try to really embed and honor our teachers by doing those defensive learning days to make sure that there's time set into the calendar. Many of our schools will give their teachers a supplemental planning period or an advisory time with the sole focus of supporting those efforts, just so from a structural standpoint, we can ensure that we're setting our teachers and students up for success with those POG efforts. And so some of our future goals really tie around clarity of the profile of a graduate beyond our defenses in daily instruction. And this is already happening in pockets in Shelby County schools, but just ensuring that that becomes a language that's more widespread throughout our 13 schools. As I mentioned, Dan and I are also working with the Kentucky Department of Education in our district with being transparent with our assessment practices and reporting that defense data publicly. And so putting a continued emphasis on that to our community to show that this is just as viable as of an assessment practice as a state test that they might take. And then, as we've talked about on several occasions, just the next steps of continuing to make sure that there's not as much variance with the scoring of defenses to ensure that there's a unified experience for all of our students across Shelby County Public Schools. And with that, I'll throw it back to the Digital Promise team.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the passion that all of you bring with these innovative practices and all the great thought that's gone into these approaches. We do have a few questions in the Q&A that I'd love for us to try to answer live. And so one, I think it was directed directly at Howard-Suamico, but I think, Shelby, it'd be interesting if you could also respond. But what about students that are learning virtually? Is there any way that these assessments students can participate if they're online?
Hi, for Howard-Suamico School District, we currently do not have a virtual piece. So we haven't really thought through that piece. So yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you.
So we actually, the example that Dan gave of the student on the NASCAR circuit was a student who was in our Cultivate Virtual Learning Academy. And so again, every single student takes part in a defensive learning. So our virtual students, we set the district expectation that they have to report to our Virtual Learning Academy site in person once a week for social emotional counseling, for academic counseling, as well as to ensure that they're keeping up with their academic progress. So those are also the times that we build in support around their defenses of learning. Most of the evidence and the artifacts that those students are doing for our defenses come directly from a result of some of the rationale for why a lot of students choose to be in our virtual learning system, ranging from being a professional equestrian. We live in the saddlebred horse capital of the world here in Shelby County, or a single mother who needs to work during the day in order to provide for her and her young child. So this system allows for any walk of life that a student is facing to be able to successfully defend their learning.
And that defense piece is really tied pretty strongly to our advisory structuring generally that exists in our buildings as well as in our online program. And that group of people are really very responsible in helping. One of the questions is about mentoring these kids through the process. They're very involved with that within our buildings. Every kid has an adult that is connected to them, and so those advisors certainly play a role. But lots of teachers are going to play a role because again, if you're going to have some flexibility in how these things are presented and where these kids kind of steer these things, you're going to need help in different ways. And so, yeah, that's how we could approach it.
Thank you so much. I think this question is for Shelby, and it was around if there are multiple opportunities for a student to show that they've succeeded at their defensive learning. So if you could speak a little bit to that.
Sure, and that's a really common question that we get. It's kind of scary for some to hear that you have to successfully defend your learning as a graduation requirement. So Dan mentioned our district's advisory system. So all of our students and all of our schools have an advisory protocol where there is an adult who is the point person for that student for academic and social emotional needs. And that advisor is really the student's cheerleader and point person for fifth, eighth, and 12th grade for our defenses of learning. If we have a student, and it happens at every single level, who does not successfully defend their learning, we will then work with the student's advisor. We will take the notes from the defense and then give that student an opportunity to redefend their learning. And we have never had a student in Shelby County Public Schools who has not received a high school diploma or has not gone on to middle school or high school for not completing their defense. So that advisor is really the person who scaffolds the learning. But I will also say most of the time, a student who does not successfully defend their learning is not the student that one would traditionally think would fall into place. Most of the time, the students who do not successfully defend learning are oftentimes our highest achieving students who look at this assessment like traditional assessments and think, I can walk in and ace this like I do everything else. And it takes some coaching from the advisor and from the student to be able to say, okay, this is something I have to prepare for a little bit more than traditional assessments.
And related, but slightly different. It's actually one of the questions that just popped up. You know, the exhibition process that exists between these defenses also provides these young men and women an opportunity to practice and get better and get more comfortable with presenting. And so what you would hope is, you know, as you do with everything academically, you're scaffolding up. And so it really is interesting to see these kids over time grow from that third grade presentation to that fifth grade presentation. I saw my own son present his eighth grade one a couple years ago, 2 years ago, and he just blew me away. I didn't know that was there. I didn't know that was in him. But just to see how much he has grown in that short period of time is cool. But that's because of lots of practice with that. You can't just expect this to be a fifth grade thing, an eighth grade thing, and a 12th grade thing, and then it to work. That just won't happen.
I think if I could add to what Dan just said, I think Dan articulated how that works in the context of a defensive learning, but as you're setting up an aligned structure for a graduate profile, right? Making sure those skills are recursive throughout the process is really, really critical. So it's not a point in time that happens 3 times, but it is a recursive system that continues to weave its way through. So what being a solutionist looks like in 3rd grade looks a little bit different than what it looks like in 8th grade, but they're still focusing on those future ready skills. So it works in the defenses of learning arena, as well as just as you're building your system. It's important to make sure that you're prioritizing that.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the stories and then the perspective too about, you know, the systemic change that we're hoping to see, you know, through these assessments. I think this one's directed at Howard-Suamico, and it's really interesting. So in terms of having teachers develop their own assessments around the future ready skills, what training and trust did this require? And how satisfied have you been with your teacher's ability to create authentic assessments that meet the depth required?
Let me start that one, and I'll hand it off to Amanda. It's a really good question.
Yeah.
Amanda does the work with the teams, and again, Amanda really envisioned this from a systems approach. So she created breakthrough teams at a variety of levels, and those breakthrough teams really engaged a wide variety of stakeholders in developing the continuums and the assessments. And so when it came to teachers trusting the work of that team, because they were involved at the ground level through Amanda's leadership, it really helped foster that in a little bit more deeply. So Amanda, maybe you could talk a little bit about the process to make sure that our teachers did have the training provided, the training necessary.
Yeah, so absolutely. So when you know, working with those breakthrough teams, you have several leaders who really were empowered to design and think through some of those pieces. So building that teacher empowerment and leadership to impact the PLCs. Ultimately, if you're very strategic on those breakthrough teams, but I think also I think process and systems, right? So like when we went all in on graduate profile, really it meant we have to rewrite our curriculum frameworks. We need to think differently around how we're looking at standards and being really intentional around the graduate profile skill development. And so through that system, we provided touch points with all teachers around really strong professional learning of alignment and questioning and thinking about essential questions, developing success criteria that includes the skills, key vocabulary identified in our continuum. One thing that really we're working through is we have a fantastic team of what we call technology integration specialists, and really thinking about the system of coaching, someone being able to work side by side with teachers around designing authentic assessments and ultimate learning activities ongoing has moved us the fastest and in the most meaningful way as well. So thinking of a coaching system, we're working on developing that and thinking about our key leaders within our schools who are working side by side with principals. And Chad showcased a little bit of our school scorecards. And I think our principals do a really good job of understanding where we're at with implementation and looking and analyzing, doing walkthroughs and looking for specific things that they've really designed personalized school-based professional learning along with their teacher leaders and coaches within the school. So I think it's about kind of like developing some of those systems and really refining them to have that focus around the graduate profile skills and the vision of the district.
I'm glad Amanda brought up the coaching process. In many of our schools, we coach around literacy and math quite a bit, but we've really taken the intentional step of coaching around the grad profile. It's something that our district calls out as a priority, and so we probably should provide that real-time embedded professional development, which really only comes through coaching. So evolving what used to be a technology specialist into really a grad profile specialist is really helpful. So if you have that at your disposal, being able to do it embedded and in real time has really started to move the needle for us.
Thank you so much. We have one more question. I don't know who wants to take this one, but the question is around math and how, when you're focusing on future ready skills, I think is the question, how does something very concrete and standards-based like math fit in?
Well, I could do one thing. I could share one performance task that we've designed as an example that I think is showcased in the report, just around that thinking. But just thinking instructionally wise, some of how our math PLCs made sense of that is when they think about how the tasks they're providing provide opportunities to showcase skills such as critical thinking. So our one of our 7th grade PLC math teams talked about really when they're doing error analysis. So providing tasks that are more authentic to a real situation and having the kids use an error analysis to analyze the solution there, and then calling out like critical thinkers analyze and evaluate. And so as critical thinkers, how are you responding to that assessment question, right? So that's just an authentic piece, but really the setup of the task could really be connected to anything in the real world. And the example that I'll link in the chat is really around rates and ratios and being able to have a table of speeds and number of cars where that could be transformed to being what's the speed limit issues in front of school and use real data. And then do rates and ratios. So they're just some different examples there.
And I'll add on to that. I just was sitting in a College Board training 2 days ago, and they talked a lot about durable skills and how durable skills, specifically in front of me, like representing data or developing arguments, proposing solutions. I mean, all of those things cut across a lot of their other courses. And so, math need not look like it's sitting on an island because all of these courses, all of these subject matters have some very, very common things and that's the whole purpose of the Portrait of Graduate in the first place, because those things do exist across contents. They are different. That's why we teach them differently, but we certainly have to keep track of the heart of why we have a profile.
Thank you so much. This has been amazing. We were shooting for a 30-minute webinar, and I just think that the conversation was so rich and we had such amazing questions. Thank you to everyone who was able to stay on, and especially our practitioners who I'm sure it's a very busy day in schools out there. I also want to take a minute to thank Alessandra and Babe, who are behind the scenes, keeping this webinar running and making sure the slides are up and the participants are here and everything's working. So thank you so much for all of that. And I just want to say a special thank you again to the practitioners, and that all of us are very open and interested in answering any of your questions. So please feel free to reach out if you saw something here you want to know more about. We would all love to hear from you, and happy to follow up with any other interesting ideas or questions that you might have. I'll also point out, Babe just dropped in the chat that if you're interested in working with Digital Promise around your portrait of a graduate, there's a link there to fill out, or you can just email me if you're interested. And a special thanks to Katie and Pearson for their starting this idea about doing this report and finding out more about assessing future ready skills, and all of your support and participation here today. Thank you so much.